Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving right into a massive, absolute game changer of historical mystery. Think back to your old history classes. We were all taught this very rigid, linear timeline of human technology, right? You go stone, then bronze, then iron. It's like a neat little ladder. But what happens when an entire, massive continent seemingly just skips a major era entirely? I mean, did sub-Saharan Africa really just skip a step in human evolution? Well, for over a century, this heavily Eurocentric assumption completely dominated the history books. The idea was basically that sub-Saharan populations mysteriously leapfrogged straight from the Stone Age right into the Iron Age. And early historians were so confused by this apparent gap, they frequently and wrongly interpreted the absence of a Bronze Age as some kind of evidence of arrested development. They just assumed these societies lacked the capacity for independent metallurgical innovation. But spoiler alert, they were way off. That totally flawed assumption actually stems from the three-age system: stone, bronze, iron. Now, this linear progression perfectly describes the historical realities of places like the Mediterranean, Europe, and the Middle East. But look at the African metallurgical trajectory. It goes stone, then some localized copper, and then boom, straight to iron. The three-age system? It is completely useless for establishing timelines in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a regional anomaly that demands an explanation, not some universal rule of human progress.
Section 1. The geological plot twist. Why bronze requires a perfect storm.
Okay, so it all really comes down to the chemical reality of the metal itself. Bronze is what's called a polymetallic alloy. You take copper and you mix it with, say, roughly 5 to 15% tin. Doing this drops the melting point of the copper significantly, which makes it highly fluid, perfect for intricate casting, while giving you a metal that is way harder and more durable than just pure copper. But here's the catch. And it's a massive bottleneck for any ancient civilization. To make true bronze, you absolutely must have access to tin. And the geological data here is absolutely staggering. Just look at the numbers. Copper is relatively plentiful at about 70 parts per million, and Africa actually has these incredibly rich, albeit localized, copper belts. But tin is exceptionally rare on a global scale. We're talking just 2 parts per million. In pre-colonial Africa, it was practically non-existent outside of a few tiny, geographically isolated pockets, like the Jos Plateau in Nigeria or Ruaiberg in South Africa. Meanwhile, contrast that with iron, 50,000 parts per million. It's ubiquitous. It is literally available practically everywhere underfoot across the African continent in these iron-rich lateritic soils. Now, in the ancient Mediterranean, making bronze was totally feasible because they had basically frictionless maritime trade. Ships could easily haul heavy, rare tin from places like Britain or Iberia right across the sea to mix with their copper. But Africa's geography, it presented this insurmountable logistical barrier. To create a continent-wide Bronze Age, Africans would have had to establish these massive bulk transportation networks, moving raw ores thousands of kilometers across virtually impassable rainforests and the vast Sahara Desert. I mean, there was no ancient Amazon prime for bulk ore, right? So the lack of a Bronze Age wasn't an issue of human intellect at all. It was literally dictated by the Earth's crust. Moving on to Section 2, the pyrotechnological leap, bypassing the bottleneck. So, think about it. If you can't make bronze, how do you make durable tools? You might be thinking, well, just skip ahead to melting iron. But thermodynamics gets in the way. See, copper melts at 1,085 degrees Celsius. Ancient populations could actually hit this temperature in relatively simple open crucibles or shallow hearths. It's totally manageable for early pyrotechnology. But iron? Iron has a staggering melting point of 1,538 degrees Celsius. That temperature is absolutely mind-blowing for the ancient world. It was completely unattainable for any furnace prior to the invention of the much, much later blast furnace. You simply could not melt it. So, how exactly do you work a metal you can't even melt? The answer is this absolutely ingenious thermodynamic workaround known as the Bloomery process. African innovators essentially realized, hey, we don't need to melt the iron at all. Instead, they utilized the solid-state reduction method. By heating iron ore and charcoal together in a highly controlled, oxygen-starved environment, they could extract the metal while it remained entirely in a solid state. It's brilliant. Let's actually walk through this brilliant process step by step. First, smelters combine that ubiquitous laterite ore we talked about with hardwood charcoal. Second, they heat the furnace up to anywhere between 1,100 and 1,400 degrees Celsius, all while tightly controlling the air intake to starve the environment of oxygen. This forces the burning carbon to strip oxygen atoms directly from the solid iron ore. Third, this chemical reaction creates a porous, spongy mass of solid iron called a bloom, while the liquid waste just drains away into what's called a slag plug. And finally, a blacksmith extracts that solid bloom and repeatedly hammers it on an anvil. This physically squeezes out the remaining impurities, creating highly durable wrought iron. Section 3. From pottery to iron. The ceramic symbiosis. So this brings up a huge question. If they didn't learn how to manage these incredibly high temperatures by casting bronze, like European societies did, where on earth did this thermodynamic knowledge come from? Well, the profound secret wasn't prior metallurgy at all. It was actually 10,000 years of advanced indigenous ceramic engineering. African iron smelting evolved completely organically from millennia of mastering pottery kilns. Honestly, it's mind-blowing when you think about it. The core infrastructure of a furnace is fundamentally a ceramic technology. To survive the intense thermal shock, they engineered specialized refractory clays. They injected air right into the heart of the fuel bed using ceramic blowpipes called tuyères. Archaeologists analyzing sites like Torre Ceratomo, for example, found that ancient engineers intentionally selected clays with elevated silica and alumina. They even engineered this genius self-fluxing process, where the furnace walls intentionally melted just enough to act as a chemical flux and separate the waste from the iron. They literally physically integrated standard pottery kilns into the thermodynamic architecture of the smelting sites.
Section 4. Debunking diffusion, the timeline of independent invention.
Now, for most of the 20th century, the old historical dogma was that iron technology simply must have been imported to sub-Saharan Africa from the north, transmitted down through places like Carthage or Meroe. But, well, the radiocarbon dates completely shatter that theory. As you can see, we're looking at iron smelting in the Central African Republic and Nigeria as far back as 2000 BCE, and at the Teramet Massif in Niger around 1500 BCE. Meanwhile, Carthage didn't securely start ironworking until around 800 BCE, and Meroe was around 300 BCE. Sub-Saharan iron technology clearly predates these northern sites by centuries.
Now, to be fair, we absolutely have to acknowledge some valid scientific skepticism around these ultra-early dates, specifically something called the old wood effect. Critics point out, and rightly so, that if ancient smelters burned a massive, slow-growing tree that was already, say, 500 years old to make their charcoal, the radiocarbon date is going to reflect the birth of that tree's inner rings, not the actual date of the smelting event. It's a highly valid scientific debate. However, and this is key, even when researchers mathematically adjust these outlier dates downward to account for that old wood, a really robust body of evidence still securely places independent African iron production at 1000 to 800 BCE. That is still way before any northern Mediterranean influence could have ever penetrated the deep interior.
Section 5. The democratization of metal. Transforming a continent.
This unique metallurgical path had a radical impact on socioeconomic structures. Think about it. The Bronze Age in the Mediterranean was inherently elitist. Because it depended on rare tin and those super fragile trade networks, bronze weapons and tools were essentially monopolized by nobles, priests, and centralized palace economies. But the African Iron Age, it was totally democratized. Because laterite ore was everywhere underfoot, production was decentralized. Almost any village could host a smelter and a blacksmith. This meant iron could be produced at scale, placing highly durable, accessible tools directly into the hands of everyday farmers. And this massive democratization of metal is actually what made one of the greatest demographic events in human history ecologically possible: the Bantu expansion. Shifting agriculturalists, armed with their newly forged iron axes and iron-tipped hoes, were finally able to migrate into and conquer the dense, virtually impenetrable rainforests of the Congo Basin. For the first time, they could clear thick primary forest canopies and cultivate tough, root-bound soils in a way that was simply impossible for purely Stone Age agriculturalists. It really was a total game changer. But you know, we really shouldn't view this transition strictly as just an industrial or economic process. Iron production held immense cultural and spiritual power. The transformation of dull earth into shining metal, it was perceived as a deeply spiritual, almost alchemical act of creation. Smelters and blacksmiths were viewed as vital spiritual mediators. The furnace itself was routinely decorated to symbolize a female womb, with the smelting process conceptualized as gestation, while those ceramic twires we mentioned, they provided the breath of life. Royal power and political authority became deeply intertwined with ritual anvils and specialized weapons. Mastery of iron was, quite literally, synonymous with the mastery of nature itself. Section 6. A unique technological path. reclaiming the narrative. So, to synthesize this entire journey, we really have to stop viewing the perceived absence of a Bronze Age as some kind of failure of innovation. In fact, bypassing it was an incredible evolutionary advantage. As this brilliant quote from the research perfectly captures, and I love this, Sub-Saharan Africa did not miss a step on the ladder of technological progress. It constructed an entirely different, highly optimized metallurgical trajectory of its own. Ancient African innovators adapted to their unique geology and utilized their advanced ceramic skills to build a democratized path that literally reshaped an entire continent. So here's a thought to leave you with. If geology determines destiny, and Sub-Saharan Africa proved that the accepted linear three-age system is actually just a regional anomaly, what other linear myths of human progress do we casually accept as universal truth that are just waiting to be shattered? Thanks for exploring this explainer with me today. Keep asking those big questions and always keep seeking the full picture.